Thomas reached for the heavy brass handle of the lighthouse door, his fingers brushing against the cold, salt-crusted iron. Outside, the Atlantic was a churning cauldron of slate-gray water and white foam, battering the granite base of the tower with a rhythmic, bone-deep thrum. It was 4:45 p.m., exactly 15 minutes before sunset, just as it had been for nearly 40 years. At 72, the spiral staircase felt longer than it used to. Each of the 114 stone steps was a familiar labor, a climb he had performed through hurricanes, through the passing of his wife, Martha, and through the long years of silence from children who had long since moved to the mainland to find lives that didn't smell of kerosene and salt air. He reached the lantern room, the air here thick with the scent of mineral oil and the faint metallic tang of the massive Fresnel lens. With the practiced hands of a man who lived by the clockwork, Thomas checked the oil reservoir and trimmed the wicks of the 5 concentric lamps. He took a soft linen cloth, carefully wiping away a stray smudge of soot from one of the hundreds of hand-cut glass prisms. Then, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he struck a match. The flame took hold, reflecting 1,000 times over in the glass until a brilliant, singular beam of light cut through the gathering gloom. He stood for a moment, his forehead pressed against the cool glass of the window, and whispered the words that had become his evening liturgy. "Lord, let this light guide someone safely home tonight." For Thomas, the lighthouse wasn't just a job, it was a fortress of routine against the creeping tide of irrelevance. He often sat in the small wooden chair by the lens pedestal, listening to the heavy weights of the clockwork mechanism drop slowly through the hollow center of the tower. It was a gravity-driven system that required him to hand-crank the cable every 2 hours to keep the light rotating. In the quiet between cranks, his mind would wander. He thought about the modern world he saw in the newspapers, the talk of electricity, of automated beacons that didn't need a man to trim a wick or watch the horizon. He felt like a relic of a dying age, a ghost tending a fire that few people even noticed anymore. He wondered if his prayers were simply vanishing into the gale. Does a small life matter if no one is watching? Does the light count if the keeper is alone? He looked out at the black expanse of the ocean, where the only thing visible was the sweeping arm of his own beacon, a white finger pointing into the void, and he felt the weight of 40 years of solitude pressing against his chest. He was a man of the light, but tonight the darkness felt particularly vast. By midnight, the storm had graduated from a gale to a full-blown nor'easter. The wind screamed through the gallery railings, a high-pitched whistle that sounded like a wounded animal. Thomas was up in the lantern room, struggling to keep the glass from frosting over. The vibration of the waves hitting the rocks below was so violent that the tea in his tin mug rippled. Suddenly, above the roar of the wind, there was a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the crash of water or the groan of the tower. It was a frantic, rhythmic pounding. Someone was at the heavy oak door at the base of the lighthouse. Thomas grabbed his lantern and hurried down the stairs as fast as his aching knees would allow. When he threw back the bolt, a wall of rain and wind nearly knocked him over. Standing there, drenched to the bone and shivering violently, was a young man. He looked barely 20, his yellow oilskins torn and his face pale with shock. This was Daniel. He was a local fisherman whose small skiff had been caught in the sudden surge of the storm. His engine had died, and the fog had swallowed the coastline, leaving him spinning in the dark with nothing but the sound of breaking waves on the hidden shoals to guide him. Daniel collapsed into the small kitchen chair as Thomas draped a heavy wool blanket over his shoulders and pushed a hot cup of coffee into his shaking hands. For a long time, the only sound was the crackle of the wood stove and the rhythmic sweep of the light above them. Daniel looked up, his eyes bloodshot from the salt spray. He told Thomas that he had been ready to let go. He'd lost his father to the sea the year before, and the debt on the boat was piling up. Tonight, when the engine cut out and the fog rolled in like a shroud, he'd sat in the bottom of that boat and prayed for the end. He felt lost, not just on the water, but in his own life. But then, through a sudden rift in the mist, he saw it, a flash of white, steady, unwavering. He'd used his last bit of strength to row toward that rhythm. "I don't think you realize it, sir," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. "That light, it saved my life tonight. But it wasn't just my boat. I was looking for a reason to keep breathing, and that light told me that someone was still watching, someone was still keeping the fire. Thomas sat across from the young man, the flickering orange glow of the stove casting long shadows across the room. He realized in that moment that all those years he had spent worrying about whether he was doing something great had been misplaced. He had focused on the size of his world, while God had been focused on the faithfulness of his service. He thought of the words from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verse 16, "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven." The verse didn't say the light had to be a sun, it just had to shine. It didn't say the works had to be famous, they just had to be good. Thomas looked at his calloused, kerosene-stained hands and realized that every wick trimmed and every prism polished had been an act of worship. "Maybe God never asked me to do something great," he told Daniel. "Maybe he simply asked me to keep the light burning." Before dawn broke, Thomas climbed the stairs one last time to extinguish the lamp as the first gray light of morning touched the sea. He felt a peace he hadn't known in decades, a realization that the smallest act of faithfulness can reach further into the darkness than we could ever imagine. The legacy of the lighthouse keeper reminds us that we often underestimate the power of our presence. You may never know how many people are encouraged by your kindness, your steady prayers, your quiet words, or your simple faithfulness in the mundane tasks of life. Sometimes the smallest light reaches the farthest into someone's deepest darkness. Let's take a moment to carry this into our own lives. Lord, help us keep our light shining, even when we feel unseen or unimportant. Use our lives to guide others safely through their storms, and remind us that every act of faithfulness matters. Amen. Remember, someone may be finding their way home today because you chose to keep your light burning. If this story moved you, consider sharing it with someone who might need a little light in their own storm tonight.